Hello, and welcome to the NEA Big Read, Central Florida. My name is Barbara Gannon. I am an associate professor of history and one of the organizers of the NEA Big Read, Central Florida. This is an initiative of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. The NEA Big Read broadens our understanding of our world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of sharing a good book. The University of Central Florida is one of the 75 nonprofit organizations to receive a grant to host the NEA Big Read project this year. The UCF College of Arts and Humanities, in association with the Seminole County Public Library and the Veterans Legacy Program, is offering programming, including this series of virtual artists' talks in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the publication of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. Published in 1990, The Things They Carried is a collection of linked short stories about a platoon of American soldiers on the ground in the Vietnam War. Based on the author's experience as a soldier in the 23rd Infantry Division, with many of the characters sharing similarities with those in O'Brien's 1973 memoir, If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home. The Things They Carried explores the genre of metafiction and blurs the lines between fiction and nonfiction. Inspired by The Things They Carried, this series of talks asks artists to consider the ways we respond to war. Can art adequately respond to war? How do artists represent the unrepresentable? Today, we are pleased to welcome Bruno Cabanes, who is the Donald G. and Mary A. Dunn Chair in Modern Military History at the Ohio State University. Dr. Cabanes studied history at the École normale supérieure in Paris and received his Ph.D. with distinction from the Université, Paris, Panthéon, Sorbonne, and the Habilitation à Diriger des Recherches from the École des Hautes Études et Sciences Sociales. Professor Cabanes is a historian of 20th century Europe, and more specifically, the social and cultural history of war. He is particularly interested in the transition that followed World War I. He has analyzed this topic from a variety of angles: the demobilization of combat troops, the traumatic impact of war on soldiers and civilians, a comparative study of the different post-war periods in the 20th century, and more recently, the environmental history of war and its aftermath. Today, we are pleased to have Bruno with us to discuss his work. Today's talk via Zoom will be structured as follows. The lecture presentation will be approximately 45 minutes. We will hold 15 minutes at the end of questions, 4 questions. Attendees' videos and microphones are not set to off, but please type your questions in the chat box to the right. Be sure you are sending your questions to me, Barbara Gannon, and the moderator will ask as many of the questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Thank you all for joining us for today's presentation. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Cabanes.
Hi, Barb. Hi, everyone. I'm from Columbus. I hope that you're all staying safe and healthy in such challenging and stressful times. I would like to extend my regrets for not being able to be with you in Orlando today. And I would like also to thank the organizers and my colleagues, Amelia and Barb, for giving me this opportunity to give this lecture online. So the topic of my lecture today is Back to the Future, Rethinking Veterans' Homecomings in the 20th century. And I would like to start my lecture by presenting this flag, which was made in 1918 to greet a regiment of British soldiers returning home from World War I. It meant, among other things, you are home again, back where you belong. We have not forgotten you. These are, of course, civilians' words intended to reassure veterans on the strength of the bonds uniting home front and frontline during the war, and which will continue to unite civilians and veterans after it. But as often with this kind of material, what is not said is at least as interesting as what is. So first of all, this flag obviously does not succeed in expressing the veterans' worries about how the world had changed in their absence. Obviously for them, the question was not simply one of finding a place in society after the war, but of finding their place again. What's more, the words welcome home give the impression that the experience of war was the same for everyone. These words speak in the same voice to those who saw combat and those who never fought. Welcome home speaks in the same voice to those who were wounded, sometimes repeatedly, sometimes gravely, as it does to those who are not. Welcome home speaks in the same voice to the soldiers and to the former prisoners of war. In short, this flag, which might equally have served for other conflicts and other contexts, for instance, to create a victorious football team, this banner flag gives the impression that the transition from war to peace posed problems neither for veterans nor for the societies that received them, even after a conflict as devastating as World War I. For decades, military historians took a similar view. Why? Because, historians are trained to think that, military historians are trained to think that wars have clearly defined beginnings and clearly defined ends. That there is a clear boundary between what we call wartime and what we call peacetime. And to be honest, of course, the reality of what I will call the long shadows of war is actually more complex and more disturbing. Turning away from a conflict is not a matter of weeks or even months. It is a long and often painful transition, something that we, even if of course we're not in wartime, if it's a different crisis that we are going to experience in the next months, it's a long transition, right? Or to put it differently, how war's end constitutes an important challenge to societies at war. Something grasped as early as 1919 by this man, the psychiatrist Karl Abraham, in his article, Contribution to the Psychoanalysis of War Neurosis, published in 1919. Abraham was a friend and close collaborator of Sigmund Freud, and he drew attention to the simple but crucial fact that World War I veterans generally experience a feeling of profound loss, a feeling provoked by the death of friends, by ruined health, by the loss of 4 years of life, a sense of loss that nothing, absolutely nothing could compensate. So let's start with this very simple question. What is actually at stake in demobilization? In the first place, I think that we can all agree that demobilization is a process that reveals much about the society soldiers left or to which they were about to return. To be sure, the soldiers' experience of demobilization has varied from one war to the next. Aside from the obvious matter of victory or defeat, it is not the same thing to return from a war as a conscript, as a professional soldier, or as a mercenary. It is not the same thing to be a male or a female veteran, as many sociologists of armed forces, military psychiatrists, and gender historians have argued. And I think there's a kind of gendered experience of demobilization, which is really a very, very interesting topic. As you know, generations of veterans often tend to compare their own demobilization with that of previous generations. For example, veterans of the Korean War, largely overshadowed by the greatest generation, might compare the end of their service to that of veterans of World War II. And yet, despite these obvious differences, I would like to advance the hypothesis that all experiences of homecoming in the 20th century have something in common. Why? In the first place, a soldier's return always involves the deconstruction and reconstruction of an identity. And here I would like to pause briefly to consider the first step. the moment of leave-taking among comrades in arms. Too often this is overlooked. Demobilization, whether organized on an individual basis, as was the case in French soldiers returning from the Franco-Asian War of 1954-1962, or collectively, think of the case, of course, of the greatest generation after World War II. Demobilization brings about the dissolution of groups of soldiers, and with it, the loss of intense human relationships. In time of war, the primary group, as you know, it's a notion that was first introduced by the Chicago sociologist Charles Cooley in 1909, but was used again in the military context and for the study of the German army of World War II by Shields and Janowitz in 1948. Primary groups are one of the most important sources of support and survival. Primary groups provide a form of mutual security. They maintain social cohesion in extreme situations by, for example, providing some sense of self-protection, at least in terms of the support of the person on your left or the one on your right. After combat, there are all kinds of supports: the distribution of packages sent by relatives, the transmission of practical know-how, or the rituals of storytelling that allow soldiers to share their emotions, to build a kind of emotional community. So when they return from war, veterans have little choice but to accept the end of this important form of group solidarity. And this is one reason why soldiers' reunions are so important in the immediate aftermath of the war. While they were so important in interwar France, for instance, in the 20s and 30s, veterans built imagined communities, veterans organizations as imagined communities, as substitutes for the group solidarity experience on the front line, as substitutes for the bonds of survival they forge under stress. And what I mean by substitutes is something more symbolic, of course, but also there's a kind of, on the kind of individual level, a kind of frustration, of course. So here's, for instance, the motto of the French right-wing veterans associations UNC, Union Nationale des Combattants, in the late 20s, unis comme au front, united as at the front. So in the case of the war position, demobilized soldiers also leave behind fields of battle that have grown familiar and under which many of their comrades are buried. And here, I'd like to present briefly Erich Maria Remarque. Of course, you know him as the author of All Quiet on the Western Front, but maybe not as the author of the little-known superb novel, The Road Back, published in 1931, but I really recommend. It's a story of a group of German veterans returning from the Great War. And I'd like to quote the book's prologue. There are many indeed that lie there, though until now we have not thought of it so. We have just all remained there together, they in the graves, we in the trenches, divided only by a few handfuls of earth. They were but a little before us. Daily we became less and they more, and often we have not known whether we already belong to them or not. But now we are going back into life and they must stay there. So, of course, they is the dead, right? So what Remarque describes in this post-World War novel is essentially the end of a community of the living and the dead. But when demobilization is organized on an individual basis, it is sometimes the demobilized soldier's comrades who take charge of preparing him or her for the return to civilian life. The mission is, in a way, to smooth the transition, as is shown in this fascinating account of the Afghanistan war veterans by Belarusian novelist and Nobel Prize laureate Svetlana Alexievich, Zinky Boys, Soviet Voices from the Afghanistan War, published in 1990. And I quote, the devil is a Russian army slang for soldiers in their third year of military service. The devil's departure was a story in itself. To begin with, there was a compulsory whip round to buy him a briefcase, a towel, a scarf for his mother, a present for his girlfriend. Then his dress uniform had to be prepared. The belt had to be brilliant white. You are not to para without a white belt. Shining the belt buckle was a work of art. First, you used medium, then fine wire wool, then a needle, then felt, and finally Goya brand polish. The uniform was steeped for a week in engine oil to restore its dark green color, then cleaned with petrol, and finally hung up to air for 1 month. Already, the devils go home, and the next lot of vets take their place. So first, I mean, what is very interesting is it's a kind of process, step by step. But to leave war is to leave a sort of savage state. The cleaning of uniforms described here by Svetlana Alexievich is all the more important since it is done in common and accompanied with other rituals, a last meal, a group portrait, an exchange of gifts. It is a sort of ritual of purification, of course, but it is also a way of making the veteran presentable to civilian eyes, of trying to turn outsiders into insiders. So deconstruction of an identity, right? But also the reconstruction of another. One of the demobilized soldiers' greatest fears, as appears in their diaries and sometimes also in their letters, is not being able to find their place again in civilian life. In their works on survivors, many psychiatrists describe a nightmare common to many returned veterans. They return to their homes, they return to their families, they attempt to speak, but are neither heard nor recognized. Many veterans experience the feeling of having survived at the price of another's life, of being alive when they should be dead, while the psychologist William Niederland, followed later by Robert J. Lifton, would in the 1960s term the survivor syndrome. It can be summarized as follows: I live, they are dead, they have therefore given their lives for me. This is what the nightmares are saying, right? We should be dead, we are ghosts. But to be recognized is not simply to recover one's pre-war identity, as we civilians often think. It's also to be recognized as a veteran, to obtain gratitude for services rendered and compensation, which is obviously not the same thing, right, for the material and psychological costs inflicted by the war. So the second element common to all cases of soldiers returning from war in the 20th century is a vast question of the gratitude civilians express or refuse actually to express to veterans, as many of you know, with respect to the end of the war in Vietnam, especially after 1968, 1969. This problem of gratitude has long been underestimated. As the victims of war became increasingly unfamiliar to Western societies, these societies, our societies, ceased to understand the importance of what I've called in my first monograph, the moral economy of gratitude, a complex and finely structured collection of rituals and gestures, medals, celebrations, commemorative objects, thanks to which the veteran feels that his or her experience has been, at least in part, recognized. So let's take a look at this extraordinary picture taken in Odyssey 1945 at the end of the Great Patriotic War. We see two soldiers surrounded by civilians. They probably wear medals on their chest. What must be noted here is the fascination with which civilians, essentially mothers, regard the soldiers and the respect with which they touch the medals. There's almost something sacred here, the way of touching the medals. That gesture is in keeping with the form of exchange specific to relations between frontline and home front, the protection given by the soldiers in exchange for the gratitude of civilians. It seems to me that we are looking here at what many veterans regard as the most important element in the aftermath of war. Peace and demobilization bring with them the dissolution of the combatants' community, as I've already argued. Fundamentally, the commandants believe that civilians behind the lines know nothing about the war, a belief that gives rise to feelings of mistrust and sometimes even contempt. Medals, especially those awarded rarely, like the Order of Glory created in Russia in November 1943, are there to save the good soldier from post-war anonymity. This history of military courage, that of the creation of moral models composed of the society's wartime representations of heroic action, largely remains to be written. In the immediate aftermath of the armistice of November 11th, 1918, there were also many rites of passage, permitting the soldiers to progressively forge a new identity, to become veterans of the Great War, step by step. That's the same issue of a progression in this transition from war to peace. And for instance, I think it's a good example. French veterans of World War I were even given, were supplied with commemorative helmets on which the words Soldat de la Grande Guerre, soldier of the Great War, were inscribed, which means this is whom what you are now. You are a soldier of the Great War. This is your new identity. Among all these rituals, one seems to me especially striking: the military parades. These parades were very common in November, December 1918. French troops first paraded in newly reconquered cities and villages of Alsace-Lorraine in eastern France, near the German border. For these men, exhausted by war, parading involved physical hardship. Combatants had to learn to march in step all over again, had to learn to present arms, to stand for long periods in cold and humid weather. In other words, the veterans had to be willing to transform hardened bodies into docile ones. So let's examine a little more closely this magnificent expression of what I earlier referred to as the moral economy of gratitude. And this photograph was actually taken upon the entry of French troops into Colmar on December the 10th, 1918. As you can see, the windows are crowded. Many look on from balconies. All the house fronts have been decked out with flags. At the left, you see a group of generals on horseback, including General de Castelnau in France, a senior commander at Verdun, who lost 3 sons in the war, in the Great War. He, and that's my point, is dressed in his uniform of 1870, a fact that gives the parade all its meaning. This is a parade of revenge, France's revenge, a generation after the humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. Obviously, a parade of this kind was a great honor for those who participated in it. As the postal control shows, regiments not permitted to participate in these parades felt great bitterness, a fact that only goes to show that all gestures of gratitude were closely examined by demobilized soldiers. So what's veterans expected from civilians, and what they still expect in many ways today, was that civilians express a sense of gratitude proportional to the sacrifices made on their behalf. And here's what the military psychiatrist Claude Barrois wrote in his 1993 book, Psychanalyse du guerrier, Psychoanalysis of the Warrior. And I quote him: obtaining a pension, being awarded a decoration, having one's name mentioned in some historical document or other, these are not regressive satisfaction like those of a deserving student duly rewarded. They reassure veterans that the collective recognizes its debt and that their years of suffering inscribed in flesh and mind alike have been given meaning. Such tokens of gratitude, often carried very discreetly or even hidden, indicate absolutely no sense of social superiority. On the contrary, they signify a reassurance that the veteran's bond with the state and nation has been clearly affirmed. This gratitude is a fundamental condition of a soldier's reintegration into peacetime life. It reinforces his sense of existential coherence, which has been shaken by the unforgettable experience of war. All soldiers returning from war in the 20th century have felt the importance of these tokens of gratitude, all the more so as they generally feel out of phase with the social norms of civilian life. And this leads me to the third element, common to all cases of soldiers returning from war in the 20th century, the passage from wartime norms to peacetime norms. The state of war, as you know, is characterized by complete upheaval of the frameworks of everyday life. In wartime, soldiers go without sleep, sometimes collapse from exhaustion in the middle of the day, and eat at irregular hours. Frontline soldiers are also men without roofs over their heads, without the protection, without the comforts, without the sense of intimacy that comes from having a home. Take the example of the trenches of World War I. Mud infiltrated everywhere. Mud swallowed up dead bodies. Mud threatened to drown the living. Put otherwise, the framework of social life, the framework of civilian life, the distinction between day and night, the difference between inside and outside, the importance of physical appearance, the importance of dress codes could not resist the extraordinary upheaval of the first month spent in the trenches. And this is very interesting to see the kind of quick transition from peace to war opposed to the kind of endless transition from war to peace. So when imagining their return home in letters, combatants often emphasize the normalization of material life, for them an essential step in the return to pre-war life. For instance, the importance of food, as you can see here with this photograph of newly discharged doughboys eating apple pies in New York City. And for these soldiers, traditional apple pies were not just food, they were memories of their pre-war life. Normalization became almost an obsession in the immediate aftermath of war. And when I say normalization, I mean also the return to moral norms. The return to moral norms and their transgression by certain veterans is one of the most complicated questions facing the historian. Literature and cinema, it is true, often draw attention to the figure of the marginalized and the violent veteran. For instance, the 400,000 German veterans who joined the extreme right military units of Freikorps and fought against domestic revolutionaries in Weimar, Germany, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, which is a perfect example of post-war brutalization that the German writer Ernst von Salomon took as a topic of his novel, The Outlaws, published in 1930, or think of Travis Bickle, for instance, the mentally unstable Vietnam vet in Martin Scorsese's 1976 film, Taxi Driver. That neither accounts nor newspapers permit us to claim that soldiers were morally brutalized by their service, as some historians may have argued for post-World War I Europe. And of course, you know George Moss's famous book, Foreign Soldiers, who more or less argues that there was a process of brutalization. You know, that works, of course, for Germany and for Russia, for different countries. That doesn't work, you know, for France or for Britain, for instance. So the studies that are available tend to testify to veterans, or at least for most veterans, moral resilience rather than their moral collapse. In sum, if the return of the wounded, if the return of the mutilated, if the return of the traumatized vets may sometimes be studied, the ordinary man who resumed the simple pleasures of life without obvious difficulty have left few traces. There is thus a constant risk of exaggerating the pathological dimension of the soldier's return. Or to put it differently, the history of happiness, the history of banality are much more difficult to write than the history of suffering. What most veterans actually experience upon their return home is a feeling of disillusionment. Take the example of this piece of cotton embroidery made by the soldier Vellel held in the POW camp of Mumsdorf since 1914, as indicated both by the ruby red pants he wears in the image and the succession of dates, 1914, 15, 16, 17, 18, which express the unbearable length of his captivity. In a manner characteristic of many prisoners, he presents himself as someone in exile, l'exilé, here on the left, taken away from his country, and above all, his country to war. What interests me here is the idealization of the representation, the idealization of post-war gender relations, the idealization of the soldier's homecoming, a woman and a little girl rejoice, applauding as they see him pass the garden hedge. It must also be noted that the little girl, who is no more than 4 years old, can't have known a father, yet in the image, she recognizes him all the same. There is a barking dog, there is a little well-kept house. The contrast between this image and the prisoner's actual experience of return is striking. But what also interests me here is the fact that this image represents what I've yet to fully explore in my own research on veterans of the 20th century, the return home, that is the return to private life, the return to intimacy. Returning to the banality of everyday life was sometimes painful. And here's how Pierre Champion, a veteran of the Great War, described his own homecoming in his book Françoise au Calvaire, published in 1924. We found old newspapers on our table, unopened letters from the month of August 1914. We read about our plans from that time. We tried to resume our usual occupations again, and none of all this seemed in the least worthy of interest to us. Many gaps, many absent men. We had dreamed of a new world, and what we found instead was a very gray, monotonous one. So let me end this lecture by briefly pointing out the ambiguity of the notion of normalization that I introduced earlier. Normalization remains one of the fundamental notions in post-war narratives. But what does it describe? What does it mean precisely? In some cases, the attempt, which was of course impossible, to return to pre-war times, thus a failed attempt at a restoration. Elsewhere, the return to moral norms and standardization of veterans' behavior. Yet, this emphasis on individual violence after the return from war, or to put it differently, focusing exclusively on victimization of veterans, carries a significant risk that we will misunderstand the vast majority of homecomings. By interpreting the difficulties of the soldier's homecoming in the 20th century only through the lens of the culture of trauma inherited from the Vietnam War, we miss the point. Most veterans don't feel brutalized by their war experience. They feel out of proportion to the new conditions of life in peacetime, or diminished, to use Louis Aragon's words in what remains the key novel about the return from the Great War, Aurélien, published in 1944, which is of course quite interesting. I mean, it's a novel published at the end of World War II about the homecoming of a soldier from World War I. In the immediate aftermath of World War I, some veterans even claimed abnormality as part of their new identity. They claimed abnormality as part of their identity. For them, for these veterans of World War I, normalization was not an option. This would have meant trivializing their war experience. This would have meant betraying the dead, which was simply unacceptable to the generation of World War I survivors who consider themselves moral witnesses to a total war. So I'd like to give the last words to one of these many more witnesses of the Great War. The French historian Jules Isaac, prior to World War I, Isaac was recruited by the publisher Hachette, the French publisher Hachette, to edit with his colleague and friend Albert Mallet a series of textbooks, later known, it's very famous in France as the Mallet-Isaac. It's a kind of textbook that many students have used in high schools, in primary schools. It's the kind of it's the most famous textbook on French history. Although too old to be mobilized in 1914, Mallet joined up as a volunteer and was reported missing in the Artois offensive in September of 1915. Jules Isaac here was severely wounded in Verdun in 1917, but he survived. In 1919, he wrote a piece called Nous les revenants, which it's a very interesting word because it means in French both we the returnees, those who return from war, we the veterans of World War I, and we the ghosts. Revenant is also a ghost. So here's what Jules Isaac wrote, which resonates as a challenge. And I don't say that I agree with him. It resonates as a kind of challenge for all of us historians who work on the homecoming of soldiers in the 20th century, and also for those like Barb, actually work on veterans of the Civil War. And I quote Jules Isaac: "If not from beyond, we return from far away, from these formidable boundaries between life and death, where few men before us had spent time. You think that you know us, gentlemen? Don't be mistaken. You do not know us anymore. You will not know us ever again. The depth of the abyss that separates the dead from the living is as deep as that which separates us from you." Thank you. So it makes time for questions. But anyway, if you don't have, if you want, you can, of course, send me questions or feedback. My email address is cabnes.2@osu.edu. Thank you again very much.
Thank you, Bruno. That was excellent. I appreciate it. I want to point out a few things. One, to all students, and this is very important, that you that interdisciplinary studies, I think one of the things that perhaps people from Europe and France are way better at than we are is incorporating things like sociology and all of those other theories you did so brilliantly.
You do that as well, Barb.
I do, but I do think it definitely shows the value of that. I want to just give some idea to the audience also. Your more recent work is The Great War and the Origins of Humanitarianism, 1918 to 24, Cambridge Press in August 1914, France, The Great War and a Month That Changed the World Forever. And just to give you an idea of who we're talking about here, he also edited a History of Modern Warfare from the Napoleonic Wars to the present. So I hope that gives you some idea of the stature of Dr. Cabanes. And I do so much appreciate your coming.
Thank you.
Now, we have some, of course, questions.
Sure.
Jim Stoddard, who was a Marine, wants to thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
He says, what similarities and differences do you see with the demobilization commonalities of the 20th century as compared to the 21st? For example, the War on Terror. In that case, the wars continue while deployments begin and end. Troops come home and return to war on a somewhat regular basis.
Sure, thank you very much. That's a very, very interesting question. The first thing I want to say is of course, this issue of the temporality of the conflict, the fact that clearly there is no clear end to this war on terror, and that in many ways, that's one of the big differences with the conflicts of the 20th century. You can, at some point, decide on an armistice or signing a peace treaty or something like that, it's not possible. You need to have some kind of, you need to recognize the enemy as a combatant, someone more or less like you. And this is, I think, a big difference with the conflicts of the 21st century, with the war on terror, with this kind of undefined or not clearly defined enemy, with this kind of endless wars. And so it's a problem of temporality. That said, there's more. And I see two elements. The first one is the gap between civilians and soldiers. And that's a big difference, I think, between between World War I, for instance, and what we experience today with ongoing conflicts. So that's why in a way, I disagree with Julie Isaac. There was still a connection between civilians and soldiers at the time. There was still a connection between civilians and veterans in 1919, because most veterans were actually conscripts who were returning to their families after the war, and what we experience today is more kind of gap, a gap in terms of experience. I mean, most civilians will not be conscripted, but there's no, I mean, it's not a perspective that most of us have of being deployed at some point, of having to fight for our country. And also in terms of experience, I think that's quite important too. I mean, we reach a point where those who have seen conflicts will disappear. I mean, of course, the soldiers of the Greatest Generation, at some point the veterans of the Vietnam War, and there's a significant gap again of experience between civilians and soldiers. And finally, I think it's an important point too. When soldiers are demobilized today, most of them return to their bases, to spaces that in a way are isolated from the rest of the national community, more or less. Of course, they still have connection with civilian life, but they return to bases and then they are deployed again. And that completely changes, I think, again, the dynamic of demobilization to the point, actually, I mean, I wonder if the notion of demobilization still makes sense, right? If it's a notion that we should still use for the conflicts of the 21st century. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a very, very interesting and very, very complex question. Very, very good question. Thank you.
So could I see some other questions from our audience? If not, I have some for Bruno while I'm waiting. One of the things, Bruno, I think was very interesting is that the subset of veterans have very different experiences, particularly as war become more technological. Mm-hmm. Has anyone ever looked at the fact that there are veterans who have horrific combat experiences, some who have some combat experiences, some are in the air, some are in the sea, some are behind the lines, some are very behind the lines. There was an unflattering description of these in Vietnam, REMFs. And I was just wondering that, has anyone ever thought about that there is a veteranhood, there still is a unity of training and purpose, but the experiences sometimes, particularly in modern war, are so distinct?
I totally agree, Bob. I think it's a very, very important point, especially the big difference between, let's call them support units, if it doesn't, you know, it's a very general term, support units and combat units. You're totally right. And of course, there's a kind of evolution since the mid-20th century and the present. I think the mid-20th century, so it's probably like, I don't know, probably the vast majority anyway of soldiers who are in combat units, and now it's maybe what, 10% or maybe even less. I totally agree. I think it's interesting to see this kind of disconnect between kind of unity of training or values or identity, which I think is quite important, and the disconnection in terms of experiences. And you know, in many ways, you know, I'm one of the most fascinating experiences I had when I first came to the US 15 years ago, and when I went to DC and saw the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, was how this VVM was organized completely differently from the war memorials of World War I in France, even World War II. And what, I mean, there are many interesting elements, of course, in Maya Lin's masterpiece, but one of them is that it's organized around years and around this idea that the unity that the experience of Vietnam is so different that you have to organize the memorial not in alphabetical order, by tour of duty, and by this. So she in a way recognizes this kind of destruction of the idea of unity of experience, and of course I'm thinking of what will be today a memorial for the Iraq War, or for Afghanistan, or for any major, or if any conflict of the 21st century. And I think, I don't have, of course, the answer to this question, but I presume that one of the important points will be two things. First, to show again, to express this kind of deconstruction of the experience, the fact that there's no unity, and the importance of the names. I mean, that's one of the major turning points of the 20th century, that names become central. Why do they become central? Because it's the recognition of armies of citizens. We have rights as citizens and as veterans, which is something new. I mean, it seems to be obvious, but it's more or less an invention of post-World War I, and of course post-World War II. But it also means that even if your body is destroyed, even if you are missing in action, even if there is nothing left of you, there's still your name, which is the unique trace of your service. That it's that the name in a way gives you this kind of remaining identity, which is so important again. So again, that's a very important point. And again, one of the questions is what kind of memorials we'll be able to build in the future for the next conflicts.
Actually, you've just suggested and alluded to our next question.
Oh, good.
This
I must admit, I cannot read the questions on my screen.
No, see, but that's what makes it better. So what do you see as a French person who has come to the United States, who's an expert in veterans issues and war? What are the major differences and similarities in how military veterans are understood, remembered, or honored in the US and France from your unique perspective as studying and living in both cultures?
That's a very good question. Several things. I want first to say that, of course, that's obvious if you want to speak of veterans, that the war experience is different. France has been invaded 3 times in the late 19th century, 20th century, early 20th century. And that's, the experience of invasion is a major difference, I think, with the US. The experience of occupation as well. And in a way, of course, there's differences in terms of war experience and the way war experience frames national memory is essential to understand the differences between veterans in the US and in France. I think that also the other difference between France and the US is the relationship with in a way the country itself, with the nation, the sense of patriotism. I mean, it's French have also, of course, a strong sense of patriotism, but it's not the same kind of rituals, not the same kind of regular evocation of the nation, of the flag, for instance. The importance of the flag in the US probably in everyday life is something essential. That's something that in a way matters as well. And for many French, I think the gap between between the military and civilians is maybe even bigger than in the US. So it's a mix of that. I'm still, in a way, that's why it's an excellent question. I'm still, in a way, thinking about that, because the answer, or the answers to this excellent question, in a way, are essential for my own research. I mean, if I want to think about that, and to work on veterans, on US veterans as a French historian, because of course, I mean, my training, my experience, I spent, 40 years of my life in France, and it's in many ways my research is still framed by this experience and history of of France and of Europe. So that's again, it's kind of ongoing, but I think it's a very, very, very interesting question.
So, what are your what do you think, given your expertise? We're at a conference on veterans. What do you think is the great unexplored issues on veterans, whether it be in the United States or in the world?
Okay, several issues. I think the main problem is the problem of the kind of level of study. We tend to study veterans on a kind of national level, and I will say that in many ways for military history, we tend to think about military history in national terms because we are trained first to think about military history in national terms, and because, again, our memory of conflicts is in many ways national memory. So I think the global history of veterans is still one of the major perspectives for the future. Being able to connect the study of veterans, not only veterans in Europe and the US, but also Asia and Europe and the US. That's one of my kind of perspective of research I have now, of trying to work with specialists of veterans in Japan, for instance, and also historians from Australia. Actually, many excellent colleagues of World War I working in Australia, and so that's the global perspective is definitely one of the main perspectives. The second one is also, in terms of level of study, trying to work on what I said in my talk, the private, intimate experience of homecomings, which is related to what historians call the history of emotions or the history of sensibilities, but it's also, in a way, gender history. So I think that we tend, as military historians, to think too much exclusively in military terms, and that we should work more with historians, again, who work on gender, who work on emotional sensibilities, and that will be very interesting. So that's very complex, of course, fields. But I'm especially interested in rituals. Why? Because that's what I've shown here, is that rituals are essential in this transition from war to peace. They are a major component of this progression from wartime to peacetime. And they are interesting because they connect the collective with the individual. Rituals are, of course, something that you perform, and that you perform as a member of a collective, as a member of the army, as a veteran, but also as an individual. It's something that you experience personally as something important in your personal life. And in many ways, even I would say the sacred nature of rituals is a fascinating topic. Let's take an example, medals. I used it in my talk. I'm so, it's very interesting to see that there are actually very few good book or articles on metals and what metals for us are like a language that we have forgotten. In many ways, it's something, at least something that maybe people in the military still understand, but civilians don't understand. And that's, I think, absolutely fascinating, because again, it's a way to think about identities, how objects of war or objects of homecoming have such a value for individuals, and why they matter to better understand wartime and peacetime, and the progression from war to peace.
And we have a few minutes, and we have some of our audience is aware of your work on Peleliu.
Oh yeah.
And they wanted to know how you were relating that, the famous battle in World War II.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. So it's an ongoing project, but I started 3 or 4 years ago. I went to Peleliu twice. I plan to go to Peleliu again next year, I hope. So the beginning of the project was really around Eugene Sledge, obviously, and Sledge's fascinating memoirs with the Albright at Peleliu and Okinawa. But in many ways, it's more than that. It started like that. It started as a project around Sledge. So I went to Sledge's archives that are absolutely fascinating. You can find, for instance, all his letters that he wrote to his family, to his father and his mother during the war. But what interests me here is more the connection, in many ways, between a small space, the archipelago of Palaus, and the small island of Peleliu, and the global space. We always use this notion, this concept of World War II. But what does it mean, precisely? What is a world war for a small territory like the Battle of Peleliu? So it's both a study of the outbreak of a battle and the emergence of violence on this island, but also a study of memory. So I'm working a lot on what it means, for instance, to live on the red zone, because, as you know, there are still people who live there, and they started demining they being a NGO, British NGO, Clear Ground. They started demining the island only, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. It's very, very recent. So for 50 years, people have been living in the north of the island, completely isolated from the rest of the islands. They can still go there, but they cannot live in the southern part of the island. So it's very interesting to be, it's one of the interesting questions here. How can you be, in a way, how can you become an outsider on your island when after this kind of eruption of violence of this fascinating battle of Peleliu? So yeah, that's one of the different topics, but again, it's an ongoing project.
I have a graduate student question. They're working on Marine Corps memory and identity through the 20th century, and they want to use memoirs and oral histories. So they wanted to know if you've used such sources in your research, and how you balance them against more traditional sources and scholarship.
Okay. Yes, I think it's essential to use oral history. I do that also for Peleliu. I do that for the Marines, but I do that, to be honest, also for many civilians, because that's one of the issues for the Battle of Peleliu. You have memoirs written by veterans, and of course, Sledge's book is the most famous one. But you have very few written sources for civilians who were there, civilians who were sent to the main island of the archipelago, and how they experienced the war, and of course for the very few survivors of the battle in the Japanese army. So oral history in that case is absolutely essential, and I've used it a lot. So after that, the question balance, yes. I mean, I totally realized that our history is difficult. I'm conducting, for instance, interviews with, of course, not survivors because they passed away, but with children of survivors of the Battle of Peleliu in Peleliu. And it's extremely rich. It takes time to do that, but it's extremely rich because in a way it brings back the flesh of memory, to use Mark Bloch's famous metaphor of the historian trying to find the personal and human experience of war. So yeah, that's definitely a recommendation I have, to use as much as our history as possible.
Well, let's see. I think that's it from our chat.
Sure.
But I want to thank you so much for being here during these difficult times. And I can't express how much we have enjoyed your participation in this.
Thank you all. I really hope to be able to meet your students next time. That'll be great. And thank you all. I really appreciate your time.
Well, I hope that better times come and you can
Yes.
come and see us personally.
I'll be great.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to our audience.
Thank you.